The rain came down in sheets that Sunday evening, the kind of rain that turns headlights into smears and makes every puddle a small, dark lake. Marcus had been driving home from his second job when he spotted the sedan pulled half off the shoulder on Clement Street, its hazard lights blinking orange into the wet dark. The driver was standing in the downpour, staring at the rear left tyre the way you stare at something you cannot change but cannot stop looking at. Marcus didn't have to stop. He was 34 minutes into a 38-minute drive home. He had a job interview the next morning, the first real one in 7 months, and he had ironed his one good shirt the night before and hung it on the bathroom door away from steam. His daughter Bria was 8 years old and asleep at his mother's house 2 miles east, and he had promised to kiss her goodnight before 10. He had every reason to keep moving. He pulled over anyway. He did not think about it the way most people think about decisions. He just pulled over, put his Civic in park, and popped the trunk. The man standing in the rain was perhaps 60, in a dark overcoat soaked through at the shoulders, holding his phone at an angle like the signal might improve if he tilted it. His face was drawn tight, not panicked, but carrying the particular look of a man who has worked a long day and is watching the evening come apart at the edges. He glanced at Marcus when the Civic's door opened and seemed to brace for whatever kind of trouble was coming next. "You need a hand with that," Marcus said. He did not wait for the answer. He was already moving to the back of the sedan. The tyre was flat from the inner sidewall, not a nail in the tread but a blowout seam, the kind that goes without warning. Marcus crouched, ran his hand along the rim in the rain. Salvageable with the spare if the spare was roadworthy. He stood and asked where the jack was. The man said his name was Gerald. He said it the way people say their names when they have been in trouble alone for a while and are not entirely sure what to do with help. He had called the roadside service app already, Gerald told him, but the wait was 45 minutes, maybe longer on account of the weather, and he had a sister in Mercy General who was waiting on a test result, and he needed to get to her. Marcus nodded and asked where he kept the jack. What Gerald did not know, standing in the rain on Clement Street with water running off his collar, was that the man crouching behind his rear tyre had spent 3 years as a mechanic's assistant before the shop closed. He could change a standard flat in the dark. He had done it in the dark more than once, in a shop bay with the fluorescent lights out and only a flashlight propped against the wheel well. He knew where the leverage sat on that particular type of sedan, how to loosen the lug nuts in the star pattern so the rim didn't warp, how to thread the bolts back in with the right torque by feel. Gerald also did not know that Marcus had $17 in his checking account. That the second job, a 4-hour evening shift stocking shelves at a grocery warehouse on the south side, was the only reason he was on Clement Street at 9:30 instead of home with his daughter. That he had applied for 61 positions in 7 months and heard back from 4 of them. And that tomorrow morning's interview was for an operations coordinator position at a logistics company he had found posted online at 2 a.m, the listing already 8 days old when he sent his resume, and he had sent it anyway. Gerald knew none of this. He stood in the rain holding his phone and watched a stranger take apart his wheel assembly with practiced hands and do it correctly. It took 11 minutes. Marcus lowered the jack and tightened the lug nuts a final time, checking each one. He stood and worked the jack handle free and folded it and set it in the trunk and put the flat tyre in the well where the spare had been. His jacket was soaked through in a way that made no distinction between the parts of him it covered. His good shoes, the ones he had planned to wear to the interview, were dark with water at the toes, and he noticed that only when he was already standing and the job was done. Gerald reached for his wallet immediately. Marcus shook his head. "You're good," Marcus said. Gerald looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has just refused something they fully expected to accept. He started to say something about covering the dry cleaning at minimum, and Marcus said there was no dry cleaning, it was just a jacket, and Gerald should get to his sister. Gerald stood there a second longer. Something moved in his face that was hard to name in the dark and the rain, some recalibration happening below the surface. Then he put his hand out and Marcus shook it, and Gerald said thank you in a way that had weight to it, that meant something beyond the word's usual function. Marcus watched the sedan's taillights disappear around the curve. Then he got back in his Civic and sat for a moment with the heater on full and his wet hands spread on his knees, letting the warmth start to reach him. He drove to his mother's house. Bria was already asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, the way she always slept, her hair spread across the pillow. His mother met him at the bedroom doorway, and they stood there together for a moment without speaking, just looking at her. His mother pressed her hand briefly against his arm. He pressed his fingertips to the doorframe and then went home and set his alarm for 6. He laid his interview shirt back out on the hanger. He found his other pair of shoes in the back of the closet, the ones with the scuff on the left toe that he had been meaning to polish for weeks, and he polished them now at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a cloth and the small tin of polish he kept on the shelf above the sink. He rehearsed interview answers in his head while he worked. He went through the standard questions, the ones about strengths, the ones about challenges, the one that asked where you saw yourself in 5 years, which was the hardest, because 5 years ago he had thought he knew and then August had happened. And now the question required a kind of faith that he had to build fresh every time he tried to answer it. He thought about Bria's after-school science program, the one he had to pull her from in March when he could not make the monthly payment 2 months running. He thought about his mother, who never once said a word about the nights she kept Bria so he could work the warehouse shift, but whose face carried the effort of it, whether she meant it to or not. He did not think about the man in the rain. He went to sleep at midnight and woke at 6. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and let himself feel for exactly 1 minute how much was riding on the next few hours, and then he set that feeling aside as carefully as he had set the polished shoes beside the door, because it would not help him in the room. The 7 months had been a particular kind of long. Not dramatic long, not the kind of long that makes a good story in the moment. Quiet long. The kind that accumulates in small humiliations so minor each one barely registers, and only the total weight reveals itself when you step back. The week in September when he calculated that he could pay the electric bill or fill the refrigerator but not both, and chose the refrigerator and called the utility company with a story about a bank error and bought himself 10 days. The afternoon in October when he drove Bria to a birthday party at a classmate's house and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going in because he had not been able to afford a gift and had wrapped a picture book he found in Bria's room that she had already read 3 times. The teacher's aide who had mentioned in November, gently, that Bria sometimes seemed distracted in class, and Marcus had sat in the small plastic chair across from her and nodded and said he would look into it because he could not say what he actually knew, which was that Bria sometimes heard him on the phone at night when she was supposed to be asleep, and she was old enough to know something was wrong, even when she couldn't say what. He had been a logistics coordinator for 6 years before the restructure. Good at it. Precise with systems, reliable with people, capable of the particular kind of calm that a shipping floor needs when 3 things go wrong at once and someone has to decide which 2 of them to let go. He had built the outbound tracking system at his previous company from a spreadsheet template into something that flagged exceptions automatically and cut the loss on delivery rate by 1/3 in 18 months. He had trained 2 junior coordinators who were still on that floor, still using the system. The regional director had once pulled him into a hallway and said, off the record, that Marcus was the strongest coordinator in the regional network and that he should seriously consider putting his name in for the operations manager opening that was coming down the line. Marcus had been preparing to apply when the announcement came down. 11 positions eliminated in the regional restructure. His was one of them. The regional director had called him personally to say it was not a performance decision, which Marcus had appreciated, but which had not changed what it was. A not a performance decision termination paid the same bills as any other kind, which was none of them. He had shaken hands with the HR coordinator and the floor manager and walked out through the lobby past the security desk where he had badged in every morning for 6 years, and the security guard, a man named Percy who had 3 grandchildren and kept their school photos under the desk glass, had not known what to say and so had said nothing except take care of yourself, and Marcus had said the same back. He had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then he had driven home. He had stood in the HR office and shaken hands and walked out to the parking lot and sat in his car for 20 minutes. Then he had driven home and told his mother, who was watching Bria that afternoon, and his mother had said, "We will be all right," in the way she always said it, with the kind of certainty that was less about the facts and more about refusing to let the alternative into the room. That was August. This was Monday morning in April. 8 months, 11 days, and 61 applications later. He made instant coffee at the kitchen window and drank it, watching the street below, dry now, the Sunday storm completely gone, the April sky a pale grey that would lighten by noon. He thought briefly about his shoes, now dry the water had not damaged them. He picked up the manila folder with his 2 printed resumes and went downstairs to the bus stop. He rode the bus to the interview because he did not want to risk a parking situation making him late. He carried the manila folder with both hands across his knees and watched the city out the window, the Monday morning version of it, the version that does not make any concessions to the weight of the specific Mondays happening inside it. Delivery trucks sat double parked on Kelsey Avenue. A coffee shop was taking in chairs that had been out on the sidewalk during the rain. A woman walked a large brown dog at a pace the dog had its own opinions about. The city looked like the city. It did not know what kind of morning this was for him, and that was fine. He had learned over these months that the city's indifference to his specific situation was not cruelty. It was just scale, and he could work within it. You showed up. You dressed the part. You answered the questions you had prepared for. You answered the question you hadn't prepared for with the only answer you actually had. The rest of it was not in your hands, and you did not spend the bus ride pretending otherwise. The company was called Hartwell Logistics Solutions. 12-story building on Meridian Avenue, glass front, a lobby with a security desk and a woman behind it who asked for his name and typed it into a computer and handed him a visitor badge with his photo on it, taken by a small camera above the desk. He sat in the row of padded chairs by the elevator bank. He straightened the folder on his lap. He watched the lobby move around him. A young woman named Claire came out of the elevator at 9:52 and introduced herself as the scheduling coordinator. She walked him to the 11th floor and left him in a conference room with a long table, windows looking east over the city, and a coffee service on a credenza along one wall. He poured himself a cup, black, and sat and looked at the skyline and thought about systems and about the routing question he had prepared for, the one about how you handle a supplier missing a delivery window on a time-critical shipment. He was looking at the skyline when the door opened. He did not recognize the man at first. The overcoat was gone, replaced by a well-cut navy suit, and the overhead lights of a conference room are different from hazard lights in the rain. Gerald's face looked different here, composed and dry. The drawn-tight quality from last night resolved into something more contained. Marcus registered the name on the placard at the head of the table before he registered the face, and then the face and the name arrived at the same moment. Gerald Hartwell, Chief Operating Officer, Hartwell Logistics Solutions. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Gerald had crossed half the room before he stopped because Marcus had stood, and something in the way Marcus stood communicated that he had made the connection and was waiting to see what Gerald would do with it. Gerald crossed the rest of the room and put his hand out. When Marcus shook it, Gerald held it a beat longer than a handshake usually goes, and the expression on his face was something Marcus had not seen directed at him in a very long time. Not pity. Not the complicated look people gave him sometimes when they learned about the restructure and the months and the second job. This was something simpler and straighter. Recognition. "I know you," Gerald said. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "How is your sister?" Gerald's face shifted into something warmer. "She's fine. Test came back clear." He gestured at the chair across from where he was pulling out his own. "Please." They sat. Gerald set a legal pad in front of him and uncapped a pen, and then did not write anything on it for the first several minutes. He asked Marcus to walk him through his background, and Marcus did, the same way he had rehearsed, organised and specific, starting with the 6 years at the previous company and the systems he had managed there. He told him about the inventory reduction in year 2, the one that saved $240,000 on the annual supply chain budget, the exact number he had confirmed from the documentation before his previous employer's records went archived. He told Gerald about the restructure the way he always told interviewers about it, which was plainly and without editorial, because what had happened, and there was nothing to be gained from performing either bitterness or relief about it. Gerald listened the way good listeners listen, with a stillness that gathered rather than deflected. He asked 3 questions. The first was about the inventory reduction and how Marcus had identified the redundancy. The second was about managing a team through a period of uncertainty. The third was the routing question, the supplier missing the window, and Marcus answered it with a specific example he had prepared, and then stopped himself from over-explaining, because the answer was complete and adding to it would only weaken it. When he finished, Gerald made his first note on the legal pad. "I want to ask you something," Gerald said, and his voice changed slightly in a way that meant they were done with the formal portion. "I want you to answer me honestly." Marcus said he would. "Last night, why didn't you take the money?" The question was simple, and Marcus had not prepared for it, which meant the answer that came was the only answer he actually had. "Because you needed to get somewhere," he said, "and it was just a tire." Gerald held his gaze for a moment. He made another note. He asked one more question about start date availability, and Marcus told him he was available immediately, this week, if that was useful. The interview ended at 11:23. Claire walked him back to the elevator. She said they would be in touch in the next few business days. He thanked her and rode the elevator down and went through the lobby and pushed through the glass door. He stood on the sidewalk on Meridian Avenue, and the April morning was around him, mild and ordinary and not telling him anything. He had done everything right in that room. He had been steady and specific and prepared. He had answered the question about the tire with the only true answer he had, and he didn't know if any of it would be enough because there was no version of this where you left the room knowing. He took the bus home. He changed out of the interview clothes and hung the blazer with care and put the shirt in the laundry pile. He called his mother to check in, not about the interview, just to hear her voice and hear about Bria's morning. His mother told him Bria had aced her spelling test, every word correct, and that piece of news sat warm inside his chest the whole rest of the afternoon in a way that had nothing to do with the interview and everything to do with why the interview mattered. He worked the warehouse shift that evening. 6 to 10, the fluorescent aisles, the scanner gun and the rolling cart, boxes of dry goods and paper products and seasonal inventory, moving from receiving to stock in the pattern he knew cold by now. He had been working this shift for 4 months. The work itself was uncomplicated, the kind that settles into your body and leaves your mind free to go somewhere else entirely, which was useful and also sometimes not useful, depending on where the mind decided to go. The other people on the shift were varied. There was a retired postal worker named Calvin who stocked the paper goods aisle and who made a quiet joke every time Marcus passed him, and a younger woman named Tanya who worked receiving and was saving for nursing school and said so exactly once and never again. The night supervisor was named Pete, who spent most of his shift on his phone, but always knew exactly where to find you if something needed moving quickly. Marcus had learned their rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of people you work beside in the dark, not through conversation so much as proximity and repetition. He was tired in a way that had real dimensions to it that night, tired from the preparation and the dressing up and the waiting and the hour of trying to read Gerald's face across a conference room table, and all of that sitting on top of 4 hours of physical work in a cold building. But he kept moving because that was what the shift required, and the shift had a set end time, and 10 o'clock was a fixed point in the dark. On the bus home that night, he allowed himself to think about it. The face on Gerald when the recognition landed, the 3 seconds of stillness, the way the interview had shifted partway through into something that felt less like an audition and more like a conversation between 2 people who had already established that they could trust each other. He didn't know what to do with that. He had been disappointed by things that felt like certainties before. He packed the thought away and went to sleep. The call came Tuesday at 10:47 in the morning. It was not Claire. It was a direct line. And when Marcus answered, Gerald's voice was the same voice from Sunday night and from Monday morning, lower and cleaner than a phone call usually made voices, and Marcus stood up from the kitchen table where he had been sitting with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. Gerald said they wanted to offer him the position. Senior Operations Coordinator. He named the salary. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. The number was more than he had made at the best point of his 6 years at the previous company. It was more than he had dared to benchmark himself against when he found the listing at 2 a.m. 8 days ago. Gerald said, "I want to be transparent with you. Before that interview, I had already reviewed your resume and you were on the short list. Your qualifications were there, but I want you to know that what happened Sunday night mattered to me." He paused, and the pause had something in it that was not calculated. A man who does what you did in that rain on the night before an interview he needed and won't take $20 for it. That tells me something about who you are that no resume tells me. I want that person running my operations floor. Marcus sat back down. His free hand pressed flat on the kitchen table, the same table where he had polished his shoes 2 nights before, and he needed something solid under his palm. He said, "I would like to accept." Gerald said the offer letter would be with him by end of day. Marcus set the phone on the table and sat with it a minute. He had imagined this call in abstract many times in the past 7 months, in the way you imagine something you need but cannot summon, as a kind of relief so large it was hard to picture its shape. The actual call was smaller and more specific than the imagined one, and that was why it was more real, why it reached into him in the way the imagined version never had. He sat still for a long moment. Then his breath went out of him in a slow, long release, and he put his face in his hands and stayed that way. He called his mother. She heard something in his voice before he said the first word, the way she always did, the way mothers develop that particular frequency over years of listening for what their children are not saying. When he told her, she went quiet in the way she went quiet when something mattered more than words could carry cleanly. Then she said, "Baby," in the voice that had nothing to do with his age, the voice from when he was 8 years old and had fallen off his bicycle, and she had come down the front steps with that particular urgency. And then he could hear her crying on the other end of the line, quietly, with her breath controlled, trying to keep it to herself. He told her to tell Bria when she got home from school. He spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon at the kitchen window, not working, not filling out anything, just sitting with the fact of it. The offer letter arrived in his email at 3:14, a clean PDF with the Hartwell Logistics Solutions letterhead and the salary number printed in black type that looked the same as it had sounded on the phone, which was a number that meant things he could not yet fully assemble. He opened it and read it twice, and then closed his laptop. He thought about the 61 applications and the 4 responses and the 8 days the listing had been up when he found it. He thought about the $2 difference between the electric bill and the groceries, and the story he had told the utility company. He thought about the teacher's aide and the small plastic chair and the way he had nodded in it as if he had not known for weeks already what was wrong. He thought about his resume, which had been strong enough to get him short-listed before any of Sunday night happened. He held that thought a moment, turned it over. Whatever Gerald had seen in the rain had confirmed something, not invented it. That distinction mattered to him. He was not on this floor because he was lucky on one Sunday evening. He was on this floor because he was good at the work, and the Sunday evening had been the door the work walked through. He thought about Sunday night, about the pull of the shoulder where the sedan sat with its hazard lights, about how close it had been, not in the way of drama, not a near thing in the movie sense, but close the way things are close when you could very easily have been a slightly different person. He was glad he was not a slightly different person. Bria called him at 3:15, running down the school steps, her voice at that outdoor pitch she used when she was excited and not yet aware she was being loud. She said, "Daddy, Grandma told me you got the job." And he said yes, he did. And she said, "I knew you would," with the absolute, unearned, waterproof certainty of an 8-year-old who believes in her father the way the sun believes in rising. And it was the most persuasive thing anyone said to him that entire day. He started at Hartwell Logistics Solutions the following Monday. The operations floor occupied most of the 4th level, a wide room of workstations organized by function, whiteboards covered in routing data and handwriting in 3 colors of marker, a floor supervisor's station in the center that could see most of the room at once. Gerald walked him through it himself that first morning, moving at a pace that was neither rushed nor performative, pointing out the systems, naming the team leads, letting Marcus ask questions and answering them straight. The team was 11 people. Marcus had their names by the end of Wednesday and something more than their names by the end of the first week. A rough sense of who needed clear structure and who needed room, who asked good questions and who stopped themselves from asking because they weren't sure if the question was acceptable. There was a woman named Renee who ran the outbound station with a methodical precision that suggested she had compensated for years of not being trusted with the bigger picture, and Marcus made sure she got the bigger picture. There was a newer coordinator named Eli, 26, who was good with data but anxious about making calls, and Marcus started CCing him on the supplier calls so he could hear the rhythm of them before he was asked to run one. He did not discuss any of this as management philosophy. He just did it because it was what you did when you were paying attention. By the end of the first week, they knew he was paying attention. And that knowledge worked through the floor in the quiet way that kind of attention always does, the way a room temperature changes when someone opens a window, gradual and then simply present. He found the first efficiency gap in the inbound routing at the end of his second week. The receiving queue had been generating duplicate orders on split deliveries, a recurring manual workaround that took 2 people each afternoon to catch and correct. He mapped the origin of the error, proposed a process adjustment that added 12 seconds to the initial entry and eliminated the workaround entirely, and presented it to Gerald in a 15-minute meeting with a one-page document. Gerald approved it the same afternoon. By the end of the first quarter, the adjustment had reduced average receiving time by 22%. Gerald mentioned it in the quarterly operations review in a single sentence, the way good managers mention good work, factually and without flourish. Marcus built a secondary tracking system over the following month, a cross-reference layer that caught purchase order mismatches before they reached the floor. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of precise, methodical work that prevents problems from becoming visible, which is the highest form of logistics management because invisible problems are the only kind the floor never has to stop for. Gerald understood this and said so in the kind of offhand way that costs nothing and means everything. Gerald came through the operations floor every few days, not hovering, more like a person checking in on something that is working the way it is supposed to work, wanting to see the working rather than to intervene in it. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of the floor for a moment and watch it run, and sometimes across the room he would catch Marcus's eye, and Marcus would nod, and Gerald would nod back. Neither of them ever talked about Clement Street again. They did not need to. What had happened there was not a story either of them was telling. It was a fact that had become part of the ground they were standing on, and you do not talk about the ground while you are walking on it. Marcus's mother watched Bria less than she used to. Not because she didn't want to, but because Marcus was home in the evenings. The second job at the warehouse finished the week before the Hartwell job started, and the evenings had opened back up into something he had not had for 8 months, which was time at the table with his daughter. He picked her up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They walked the 6 blocks from school to home most days, Bria carrying her backpack at the angle she always carried it, tilted so the strap pulled across the front, a habit he had given up correcting because she had explained to him once, patiently, that it was more comfortable that way. And she was right. She talked on those walks the way she talked when she had been storing up things to say since morning, and had finally found someone to say them to, in rapid, connected paragraphs that moved between topics without signalling, her voice rising when she was pleased and dropping to a whisper when she was sharing something she considered significant. He listened and asked questions, and she answered them, and then went somewhere entirely different, and he followed her there. Those walks were 6 blocks, and they took 20 minutes. He would not have shortened them. He thought sometimes on those walks about the evenings that had not been available for them during the 8 months. The evenings he had been at the warehouse or studying job listings or too tired after both to be fully present, even when he was physically in the room. Bria had not held it against him. She had simply waited with the patience of a child who trusts that the person they are waiting for will come back. He had come back. He was aware of what that patience had cost her and what it had cost him that she had needed to extend it, and he did not let himself off the hook for it, but he also did not let it become the story, because she was 9 now and the 6 blocks took 20 minutes, and she was telling him about the 2-toned frog she had seen in the science room's tank, its back half one colour and its front half another, as if it could not decide. He re-enrolled her in the after-school science programme in September. The teacher remembered her, said she was glad Bria was back, and Bria walked into the classroom at the start of the new session like she had never left, the way children return to things they love without ceremony, without acknowledging the gap. Marcus stood in the hallway outside the classroom for a moment before he went back downstairs, listening to her voice in there. He could not make out what she was saying. He just wanted to hear it in that room. In November, Gerald's sister came to the office to drop off something for him, and Gerald brought her by the operations floor and introduced her to Marcus. Her name was Diane, and she shook Marcus's hand and said, "Gerald told me what you did for him in the rain." And Marcus said it was just a tyre, and she looked at him with the clear eyes of someone who has recently had a test come back clear and is in the business of knowing the difference between small things and large ones. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why it wasn't." The winter that year came in cold but not cruel, the kind of winter the city handles easily. A few hard weeks in January and then a slow give into February. Marcus drove to work most mornings now, the Civic reliable enough and the parking manageable with the employee pass. He drove different routes depending on the traffic, the city shifting its geometry depending on the day. Sometimes a route sent him down Clement Street. He would pass the stretch of shoulder where the sedan had sat, and it never looked like anything in the daylight, just a strip of asphalt at the edge of a city going about its business. No marker, no reason a stranger would slow down there. He never pointed it out to Bria. She didn't need to know which stretch of road it was. She just needed to know, in the way children learn what their parents are before they have words for it, that her father was the man who stopped. A year to the day from that Sunday evening, Marcus sat at the operations floor's standing table reviewing Q3 routing data. His phone buzzed. A photo from his mother. Bria, 9 now, sitting at his mother's kitchen table, homework spread in front of her, a completed spelling test pinned to the refrigerator behind her with a magnet shaped like a banana. Every word correct. Again. He texted back a single heart and set his phone face down and returned to the routing data. Around him, the operations floor ran the way it had learned to run, the teams moving through their stations with the comfortable efficiency of people who know their work and know who is watching them and trust that the watching is not surveillance, but attention. The boards updated, the numbers moved in the right direction. Marcus finished his review at 6:43, powered down his workstation and rode the elevator to the lobby. He pushed through the glass door into the November evening, the air sharp after the controlled warmth of the building, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He thought about rain, about the specific way his jacket had felt when he got back in the car, soaked through and heavy across the shoulders. About 11 minutes in the dark on Clement Street, and a man holding his phone at an angle, hoping for signal. He thought about Bria's voice on the school steps saying, "I knew you would." He thought about that. It was just a tire. It was never just a tire. The work you do when no one is watching is still work. The person you are at 9:30 in the rain on a Sunday when you're tired and your interview is 12 hours away and your shoes are going to get ruined, that is not a different person from the one you are in the conference room on Monday morning. It is the same person, and the world, eventually, catches up to knowing that. Marcus walked to his car in the parking structure, drove home through the November dark, and arrived to find Bria awake at the kitchen table doing a drawing she would not show him until it was finished. Her tongue pressed to her upper lip in the concentration face she had worn since she was 2. He made dinner. She finished the drawing. She turned it over and slid it across the table to him when they were done eating, and it was a picture of a man in a car in the rain, done in crayon, the rain rendered as blue diagonal lines and the car as a recognizable rectangle with 4 circles. She had written his name inside the rectangle. Daddy. He asked her what the man in the car was doing. She looked at him like the answer was obvious. "Stopping," she said. He put the drawing on the refrigerator. He left it there. Have you ever had someone stop for you when they didn't have to? Leave it in the comments. And if this story found you tonight, there is another one waiting about someone else the world counted out, and what happened when they were finally counted back in. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes.